course, the inauguration was going to provide numerous moments of contention and contemplation. There are so many to get through today, but we'll do our best. Let's start simply with Elon Musk's apparent salute. Of course, you, like me, consume certain strands and streams of media, so you'll have already seen by now, I'm sure, various famous people doing Nazi salutes. You might have seen the Taylor Swift one. Have you seen the Kamala Harris one? Have you seen almost everyone doing? And now, should I get that dubious honor of being worthy of further cancellation, here's me, while sort of saying, while physically demonstrating what a Nazi salute is, potentially being used. Now, although it's a kind of a semi-trivial point, it's worth mentioning, isn't it, that the gesture itself and the shape of the body, if you're suggesting that that has an absolute meaning or even an encoded meaning, you're making a claim that you understand an absolute reality. It's possible, at least possible, that Elon Musk tapped into intuitively whatever that feeling is, to sort of pat your heart and to extend your arm. If any of you have ever tried Kundalini yoga, they talk about the specificity and meaning and power of certain bodily positions. There are various sort of yogic positions that are designed to solicit certain types of energy.
All right, I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined, as always, for our brand new season by super producer Jake Appett and our very talented graphic designer J. Andrew World. That, of course, was a friend of the show and esteemed philosopher, metaphysician.
For a multi-hyphenate like that, you can't even put a label on. You can't call him one thing, right? For a Renaissance guy,
I think world historic genius is what we're going with. Russell Brand explaining that if you claim that Elon Musk did an intentional Sieg Heil at the inauguration, you are therefore claiming that you can know ultimate reality, which obviously this is just a rookie mistake. None of us could know any ultimate reality. I mean, like this could be a computer simulation. I mean, it could be that you guys don't exist. I could be a brain in a vat being subject to complex electrochemical simulation to make me think I'm podcasting right now. I could be, Charlemagne, having an acid trip. I mean, we just don't know. So until we get these questions sorted out, we should really just reserve judgment about what Elon was doing with his hand, and I don't know, maybe also autism.
And can I just say that for a brain in a vat to be tricked into thinking that they're podcasting is probably the worst, cruelest kind of punishment, just constantly podcasting for infinity.
It just seems like an episode of like Star Trek Lower Decks.
Yes. That's a good point. We got to drop the topic because there's so many metaphysical things that maybe you could approach it on like your Sunday philosophy segment, but we don't have time
for
to even get
mere
into
mortals
this.
such as ourselves.
Yeah.
The metaphysics of it are just overwhelming to contemplate, and I think it would be a mistake to even try to touch it with our thoughts. I mean, perhaps we could throw our heart in its general direction, which is a gesture that we're all very used to making, in our daily lives. Like,
well, if you've done Kundalini yoga like I have, it's pretty common. It's pretty common.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually kind of funny. So on Inauguration Day, I was texting with David Griscom, and he asked me if I'd seen that, and I actually hadn't at that point, right? And he was like, "Oh, what do you think about this Elon salute thing?" Right? And honestly, my first gut reaction after I looked it up was like, "Yeah, that sounds like bullshit," right? Like this is the kind of thing that, I mean, it's been a long decade since Trump came down the escalator. We started the Trump era, and there have been so many stupid little Trump controversies that felt exactly like this. People would get really excited about something for 5 minutes on social media, and then new facts would come out, and it'd be really murky what happened. Can't touch absolute reality, right? So, but it's but like seriously, like it is very often true, right? In the last 10 years that that like the internet decides that something is true, and then 5 minutes later it's like, probably not, right? Like we could probably think of like 100 examples of that without breaking a sweat. And this kind of felt like that pattern to me. It's like, it's like, oh, it was probably like a still image of him doing that, and it's out of context or whatever. And David was like, yeah, I don't know, man. I think that might have been on purpose. And I went back and I watched the full video. I was like, oh, holy shit. That's yeah. I don't think he did it to signal to, Hydra, that the coming of the Fourth Reich was imminent. I think that he did it because his brain has been broken by Twitter in much the same way as a multitude of non-fabulously wealthy right-wingers' brains have been broken by it. And he thinks it's like based and cool to, trigger the libs, by doing that. And that whole, oh, see, I was throwing my heart. I mean, it's like, come on, man. That's a South Park joke from 2012. Somebody does like a really snappy, Hitler salute. And then they're like, oh, see, I'm throwing you my heart.
Yeah. And, we were talking about this, but, and there's even if he meant it as a joke, there's a difference between a joke that's purely ironic and literally is the opposite of what you believe, that you're just expressing it as a joke, and like, how far off are you that, or is it really the kind of joke where you're trying to kind of create space, right, to push the boundaries of what's possible, of what the right is willing to say and do, right? And those,
well, I mean, people do. I think
yeah.
you reported this out at the production meeting yesterday. People very often will do things that are like, yeah, they go further than what they actually believe, but like, it's like, and people do this from all sorts of perspectives, right?
The left all the time, like
totally,
for sure,
right?
violent rhetoric on Twitter. It's like,
that you're saying something. It's like, oh, haha, it's a joke because like I'm exaggerating, right? But look, I mean, I am on record for years now as a left critic of fascism hysteria, and I haven't really taken any of that back. I mean, I'm going to be talking about it in the monologue in a minute, but like, I think you got to have a little nuance here. That it's like, all right, yeah, look, do I think we're going to have like fascism in the United States? Like one party state, police state, concentration camps for political dissidents, fascism? No, absolutely not. Right? I think that our shitty, awful, half democratic institutions are pretty good for keeping everybody pacified while capital keeps accumulating, and I think like that kind of literal outright fascism is something that the capitalist class generally only resorts to when they're terrified they're going to lose everything in a socialist revolution, which sadly is not something that they're terrified of right now, right? I mean, we've got like a 6.7%, right, of private sector unionization. So it's like, if we're talking about what's on the menu of historical possibility in the United States in the 21st century, I think that's a totally correct view, right? What I just said. But like, if we're bravely going where Russell Brand says we cannot go, and speculated about what Elon Musk seems to think, it's like, I don't know. I mean, if you remember that game Axis and Allies, I think his preference might not have been to play the Allies. I mean, we've got his remarks at the AfD meeting, right? This is if you're not familiar with Alternative für Deutschland, this is the most right wing part of the German electoral politics spectrum, and this is what Elon had to say to them.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say that I'm very excited for the AfD, and I think you're really the best hope for Germany. I think something I think that is just very important is that people take pride in Germany and being German. This is very important. It's okay to be proud to be German. This is a very important principle. And it's okay, it's good to be proud of German culture, German values, and not to lose that in some sort of multiculturalism that dilutes everything. You know, I think we want to have unique cultures in the world. We want to have people that have, you know, we don't want everything to be the same everywhere, where it's just one big sort of soup. You know, we want to have something where you go to different countries and you experience a different culture and it is unique and special and good, that the German government takes actions to protect its citizens and make sure that it seeks the health and well-being of the German people. The German people are really an ancient nation, goes back thousands of years. You should read Julius Caesar's account of first encountering the German tribes in the Gaulic campaigns. He was like, wow, very impressive. They're very powerful warriors. I think there's frankly, too much of a focus on past guilt, and we need to move beyond that. Children should not be guilty of the sins of their parents, or even let alone their parents, their great grandparents, maybe even. And you should be optimistic and excited about a future for Germany.
Anthony, you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted for some reason.
Am I?
Yeah,
not
anymore.
Okay.
Not anymore.
So some thoughts about the importance of preserving German culture.
What I was gonna say is I think, if we have anyone, probably not, but if you're on the fence about this Elon Musk thing, I can't metaphysically prove what's in his heart, but let's try to take all of the culture war bullshit out of it. And let's say you had a friend, right, who was accused of doing a Sieg Heil, right? And then you're like, or someone's telling you about a stranger, and then you're like, oh, what'd they do the next day or the day before? Oh, they were actually, they were in Germany the next day talking about the importance of preserving German culture and not being, and not being guilty for the sins of our ancestors. That claim, that you might hear that one claim alone and say, should have someone be held liable?
No, nobody should be held responsible for
but
grandparents
can you
did.
put it all together? Put together the picture of what he's doing.
I don't know.
Thinking.
I don't actually think that it's bad that Germany is too preoccupied with the badness of what happened in World War II. I actually think that's appropriate. I mean, that's I don't know. I mean, it's it
was pretty bad. I don't know.
It was pretty bad.
Is that okay?
It was pretty bad. Like you should look into it. Very bad. And yeah, it's like that. Was it that that Norm Macdonald thing where he's on some talk show. He's like, "Hey, you guys know about this Hitler guy? The more I read about it, the less I care for him." But it's I don't know. That was pretty recent, in the greater scheme of things. I mean, both of my granddads fought in World War II. It's not that long ago. I think that the United States, that it would be very healthy if we were a bit more preoccupied with the badness of the millions of Vietnamese peasants that we killed in the 1970s, right? That would be appropriate and good and healthy. It's actually very bad that that's not really on our radar at all, right? It's I don't know. I mean, if you are at the site of the crime of the the greatest atrocity that happened in the modern world, I think being keenly aware of that, and again, not that it's people who weren't born yet that they're morally responsible for it somehow. Of course they're not, right? But never again. You should would maybe be served by being well aware of and spending a lot of time thinking about the badness of what happened, and perhaps drawing some relevant conclusions about how German ethno-nationalism is not a good thing. And again, I mean what really bothers me about this, I mean, again, I think beyond the fact that I think Elon Musk just has some incredibly gross historical opinions. You know, I was kind of comparing it. We were talking about this last night to, you know, look, I don't think that most American Republicans, you know, literally want to reimpose slavery. But like, I also think that, you know, and they're like, oh, actually, why, you know, why can't we be proud of the Confederates? It's gross. It's not good, right? Like, you know,
They were bad people.
Yeah, they're really bad people. Not just a little bit. Like, you know, like you were a dick to your friend, or you know, you cheated on your girlfriend once or something. But it's like very, very bad. Right? It's like fought one of the bloodiest wars in history in order to preserve their right to enslave other human beings. You know, it's pretty bad, right? And it's like, yeah, I don't, you know, what really bothers me about it more than the history, even though, is just the present day nativism, right? Like when Elon says, oh, we don't want German culture to be lost in this multicultural soup. And of course, that's also something he thinks about, you know, American culture, I guess, right? I mean, this is, you know, one of Trump's day one executive orders was, you know, I mean, it's almost certainly not going to get through the courts, you know, but it's an attempt to end birthright citizenship, right? So would literally take citizenship away from millions of people, you know, and it's like, yeah, I don't, you know, like the multicultural soup, right? I think the soup is good. I think it's like, you know, I think if you, I don't know, I mean, if you like, you know, it's just, you know, we're January now, right? I mean, last month, right? You know, I remember having this thought, you know, I was over at like my parents' place for the holidays. Then, you know, coming from a mixed background, there's like a Christmas tree and a menorah, like, you know, on the mantle behind it. It's like, oh, I like that. I think that's good, right? That's, I think the cosmopolitan mixing of people and cultures is like basically an unalloyed historical good, right? Like I am, you know, I like the fact that I live in a city when I'm in the United States that has where like Korean tacos are a common thing, right? Like, I cannot see any way in which this could possibly be a bad thing, right? I mean, this, you know, this is sort of so, I guess, foundational to the way I see the world that I actually literally have a hard time wrapping my mind around how anybody could think that was bad.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I'm sure, you know, greater theorists than me have probably made this point, but it seems like the bigger threat to there being distinct cultures in different countries is capitalism, right? Because that's what creates the homogenization of fucking everything, right? Like just like wherever you go in the world, that there's certain brands and certain you know, chain restaurants and stuff like that. I mean, I think, you know, the thing that he's talking about, I don't know, I just feel like that is what kind of erodes. And you know, that's not the worst part of capitalism, but I think that is a bummer of like going to like a different country and you're like, oh, this just feels like, you know, there's all these chains here or something. Although I do, you know, sometimes go to I haven't traveled in a while. I did go to McDonald's and see if you know, burger tasted different. Did not. You had to actually order one of the specific items.
You know, it's funny. I actually haven't been to a McDonald's in Mexico in the last couple of years because it's just not close to where I am when I'm there. But I did go to McDonald's in Mexico City in 2019. I spent the weekend there. Matt McManus was like had me like speak at the university he was teaching at back then, and I will say the McDonald's in Mexico, at least in 2019, they're like had these like deep fried apple pies at McDonald's. It's like, okay, you know, point to Mexico. This is better.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that type of like kind of gross homogenization that he's does not come from just people coming in and natural culture.
Well, I mean, if anything, it's the opposite, right? People coming
people
in.
like him.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, he's the one who's causing the problems he's complaining about.
Should need to send him back to South Africa. Yeah, I mean, like, no, people coming in and like, you know, one of the things that immigrants do is they like start restaurants, right? So it's not just all homogenous that, you know, you have lots of options of places to go to. I mean, you know, you might get mixtures later. And, you know, again, you know, if you think it's like a terrible thing if your kids decide to like marry and have kids with somebody from another culture, then, you know, I guess I don't know what to tell you, right? That strikes me as something that should be up to the kids. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is like I've been thinking about this a lot the last couple of weeks. Like, a thought that I've had many times in the last 15 months, right? Since the the genocide in Gaza has been going on, is that this is going to be a really funny sentence, but like, bear with me, right? There is a certain sense in which nothing makes me feel more patriotic than thinking about Israel, by which I mean not, it makes me swell up with pride that my country is sending 2,000-pound bombs to the IDF to, drop on schools and hospitals and refugee camps. I feel sick about that part. But in the sense that, like, I feel really grateful that when the Jewish side of my family, the time came to get the fuck out of Ukraine, that instead of migrating to Palestine, they came here, because that means that I got to grow up in a pluralistic, multi-ethnic democracy. And, similar thoughts apply to, my Croatian great-grandfather not staying put and all that, right? It's like, I think it's really good that, at this point in American history, I mean, long time coming here, right? We see above re-slavery, etc., right? But like, at this point in American history, we really have largely detached the concept of nationality from, ethnicity or race or ancestry or any of that stuff, right? Like, nobody talks about being like a quarter American, right? Like that, the combination of words would sound funny, like as a category mistake. And it's really good, right? I mean, this seems like civilizational progress to me, right? That this is the nation is just composed of whoever's here. And so that's why the birthright citizenship stuff seems so evil to me. Or seeing, Elon at the AFD talking about, making sure that, the Germanness does not get watered down, and, the multicultural soup, right? It's like, this is, this is just, I mean, I don't have anything funny to say about this. I mean, this is just horrifying.
Well, from one horrifying point to, I don't know, maybe another, Ben, but I understand that you have, since it's the first episode of the new season, you have an opening argument that you want to make. Have I heard correctly?
Yeah. So this is going to touch on some of this, and I should say, by the way, that after I'm done with this, I don't know if we're going to be able to play the whole thing tonight. Just for the sake of time, we might leave out some of the end, but we do have the video of my conversation with Matt McManus in Los Angeles. Saturday before last, right? So we're going to play at least most of that tonight. If we don't play all of it, we'll release the whole thing, imminently. But yeah, we will do that afterwards. So opening argument time. All right. It is morning again in the Gulf of America. That's right. The long national nightmare of a body of water with the word Mexico in its name touching our sacred American soil has finally come to an end. And, you might be thinking, Ben, I don't give a shit what they call the Gulf of Mexico, in which case my response would be that that's a shame, because renaming an ocean basin after America is literally the high point of what we can expect Trump to do in the next 4 years that will in any way, shape, or form benefit Americans. Otherwise, every indication from the last week since Trump has taken office again has been grim. Trump surrounded himself with the phalanx of tech billionaires at his inauguration. In the protective covering of some of the wealthiest men on the planet, he gave an inauguration speech where he didn't so much as mention all of the Americans who don't have health insurance or don't get paid enough to know that they're going to be able to, how they're going to be able to swing both rent and groceries next month. But he did find space for 2 whole paragraphs about how he was going to retake the Panama Canal from Panama. How exactly he was going to accomplish this, he didn't say. The United States signed a treaty to return the canal to Panamanian control in the 1970s, and the return was finalized at the end of the 90s. It's theirs. At this point, the only obvious way to take it back would be to actually send troops to reinvade Panama. Is Trump going to do that? I have no fucking idea. Neither do you. Neither does anybody else. We're just going to have to wait and see. Here's what I do know, though. If we do end up fighting a war to seize and annex Panamanian territory, none of the children of any of those tech billionaires who surrounded Trump at the inauguration are going to fight in that war. The people who come back in flag-draped coffins are going to be the children of the working class. Probably the high watermark of absurdity in that inauguration speech was Trump's promise, and this doesn't sound real, but I swear I'm not making this up, to plant the stars and stripes on Mars to spread our manifest destiny to that planet. And yes, he actually did use the exact phrase, spread our manifest destiny. It was kind of the perfect Trump era moment, the kind of thing that makes Matt McManus's phrase, postmodern conservatives, the perfect description of Trump era Republicans, because, okay, it's bizarre and deeply alarming to hear an American president using the phrase manifest destiny in the third decade of the 21st century, but also how seriously can you take it when the immediate context where the sentence that he said it was about Mars? But I actually think this is a really revealing turn of phrase. I wrote an article about this for Unheard called Is Trump Just Another Hawk? My answer would be yes, but a slightly different way of getting to the same point I was making there would be this. We're going to be talking about Henry Kissinger a bit in the postgame. For patrons, we'll be chatting with the frontman of a post-punk band that has a song about Kissinger called Rest in Pissinger. But the reason I'm bringing Dr. K up now is that Kissinger's death a little over a year back was another one of these deeply revealing moments. Because you had all these Trumpy or certainly Trump-adjacent right-wing populist types in magazines like Compact and The American Conservative, or, for example, Sagar Enjeti. He did a debate with Crystal Ball and Breaking Points about this, saying, oh, Kissinger wasn't all bad. He was a realist, not a neocon. And they were saying that about, the butcher of Cambodia, the guy who passed on Nixon's famous instructions to the generals after his discussion with him. Anything that flies on anything that moves. The guy who said, I don't see why we should let Chile go communist just because its voters are irresponsible. And this is the guy they're saying, not so bad. At least he's not a neocon. He was a realist. That's a pretty good indication that a lot of these people's objections to the neocons didn't have a single goddamn thing to do with any kind of more basic opposition to waging imperialist wars in foreign countries that hadn't done anything to us. And in fact, I think if you listen closely to a lot of what these right-wing populist types say when they're attacking Bush-era neocons, they don't say that the problem with the Iraq war was that it was a monstrous crime to cluster bomb, invade, and occupy a nation full of people who didn't want us there. They say that the problem is that it was a foolish attempt to spread freedom and democracy where it wasn't really going to work and that it was against American interests. And that's actually more like a foreign policy version of the kind of conservative rhetoric that Albert Hirschman talks about in his book, The Rhetoric of Reaction. Hirschman breaks down the typical tropes of right-wing rhetoric in opposition to any kind of proposal for positive social reform and to what he calls the futility thesis, the perversity thesis, and so on. It won't do any good, or actually it's just going to make everything worse. They'll claim that raising the minimum wage will actually hurt the people it's supposed to help because minimum wage hikes allegedly increase unemployment, even though, by the way, having brought up that example, I do feel the need to say first that there are a lot of empirical studies that undermine that claim. In fact, that's what I was talking about in that sample from the old Debunk song from the Michael Brooks show where I used the phrase data from a bunch of different countries. That's what I was talking about as a minimum wage study. And second, even if it does lead to a bit more unemployment, that's not a reason to let people continue to be paid poverty wages. Since most minimum wage workers will benefit from the hike and not lose their jobs. And if some people do lose their jobs, you can make up for that by creating new jobs in the public sector, like FDR's public works programs in the 1930s. But those are exactly the kinds of details that the reactionaries Hirschman is writing about don't engage with. Instead, they just kind of portray it as this like profound wisdom about human nature that, see, if you go around trying to fix everything, you'll just make a mess of it all. Better to just let it all be. And that's exactly the way these supposedly non-interventionist right-wing populist types talk about neocon foreign policy. You see, these misguided do-gooders are trying to spread freedom and democracy to these unenlightened savages. It won't work. You'll just make a mess of things. It doesn't serve American interests, which is exactly the opposite of a Chomskyite kind of left critique of the neocons. We always thought that Iraq was an exercise in aggressive American imperialism being justified by paper-thin, unconvincing appeals to freedom and democracy. Our objection was never that we didn't think Iraqis were capable of democracy. We would have celebrated if Saddam Hussein had been overthrown in a popular democratic revolution. It was that we didn't want American working class kids to have their lives thrown away, as indeed, one of the guys I went to high school had his life thrown away in that war, in an invasion that was ultimately being fought on behalf not of the Iraqis, but of the global dominance of the American empire. The good of the Iraqis would have been not cluster bombing, invading, and occupying the country against the will of the vast majority of the people who actually live there. And the reason for this whole digression on these two ways of criticizing the neocons is that when we see Trump openly talking about manifest destiny, when he spends 2 paragraphs, the inauguration speech, ranting about the need to retake the Panama Canal from the Panamanians, when he tries to pressure Denmark into selling America Greenland, which he's apparently been doing in the last week because he says we need it for national security reasons as a beachhead for opposing Russia and China. And he pointedly refuses to take military force off the table if economic pressure doesn't work. Is he serious about it? Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. I don't know how he could possibly be making it any clearer that the impression so many Americans have that Trump is a non-interventionist was always bullshit. And by the way, I blame Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party for aiding and abetting that impression by going around the country campaigning with Liz fucking Cheney and constantly bragging about being supported by Dick Cheney. We're being supported by everyone from Bernie Sanders to Dick Cheney. Remember that? And generally doing everything in her power to give voters the impression that out of the two of them, Trump was the candidate who was going to be less enthusiastic about American and military intervention around the world. But as he is making clear in every way that he possibly can right now, not just the absurd flourishes like spreading manifest destiny to Mars and making Canada the 51st state, but also doing things like signing an executive order to officially declare the Mexican drug cartels to be foreign terrorist organizations, which is a way of cracking open the door to, at least building a case for U.S. military intervention in Mexico, and saying that we need to take back the canal. We'd have to reinvade Panama to take. He's making it so goddamn clear that any objection that Trump world ever had to the neocons was not about non-interventionism. It was that he disliked the fact that they made a half-hearted effort to say that their wars had something to do with freedom and democracy, because he thinks freedom and democracy are for chumps, and that we should just aggressively pursue American interests with no pretense to any of that shit. If Greenland is strategically vital, we should just take it. If the Panama Canal Treaty was a bad deal, we should just reverse it. International law be damned. And certainly the will of the people who live in Greenland be damned. That's not non-interventionism. That's just moving away from the absurd, hypocritical, humanitarian imperialism of the neocon era to frank, unabashed 19th century style imperialism. And speaking of the 19th century, a magnificently revealing part of the inauguration speech was the couple of paragraphs that he spent praising the memory of William McKinley. He also talked about McKinley last year when he was on Rogan. He's becoming obsessed with McKinley. And it's amazing because for years and years, ever since Trump came down that fucking elevator, I've been hearing that he's a populist. I've been hearing that from people like Steve Bannon who think it's a good thing. And I've also been hearing it from alarmed centrist libs who think it's a bad thing, right? The kind of people who think that Trump's right-wing populism and Bernie's left-wing populism are equally, dangerous. But I've been hearing it from all of them. They all agree on that much. And here we have Trump praising William McKinley. I wrote an article about this for MSNBC, and I just want to read you a few paragraphs from that article to make it clear why I say this is so magnificently absurd. So according to Thomas Frank's book, The People Know, the word populism was first coined on a train ride from Kansas City to Topeka in 1891. The group on the train was looking for a catchy word to describe the adherents of the political party they'd just founded. During its brief moment in the sun, the People's Party was one of the most effective third parties in American history. At its core, they were a movement of poor farmers being ground down by big banks and monopolistic firms, although they also worked to build bridges with urban workers, and they attracted support from labor union leaders like Eugene Debs, who would go on to become America's most prominent democratic socialist. According to Frank, the Kansans on that train in 1891 came up with the name in conversation with a local Democrat who knew some Latin. A populist was someone on the side of the populists, right? Latin for the people, against wealthy plutocrats. The original populists wanted to ease the financial burdens of small farmers by moving the United States off the gold standard, but they weren't by any means a single issue party. They advocated a whole raft of reforms, ranging from a shorter work week for the urban working class to public ownership of railroads to the direct election of senators. This was a broadly popular agenda. In the 1892 presidential election, the populists nominated James Weaver, a brigadier general in the Union Army in the Civil War, and he actually won 4 states, right? Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, and North Dakota. It was the only time a third party won even one state in decades, and it wouldn't happen again until Teddy Roosevelt's third-party bull moose run in 1912. In 1896, though, the Pops decided not to run a candidate of their own for 2 reasons. One is that the Democratic nominee, William Jennings Bryan, adopted important parts of the populist platform. The other is that the populists were terrified that if they didn't line up behind Bryan, they'd split the vote and throw the election to a man they deeply hated and regarded as an ultra-reactionary champion of big business and the big banks who were crushing them. Republican nominee, William McKinley. Bryan ended up running with the nominations of both the Democrats and the populists. Wealthy interests mobilized behind McKinley. Frank writes that pro-McKinley newspapers routinely fear-mongered about the Bryan campaign with comparisons to the French Revolution. Political cartoonists loved to depict populists as marching peasants wearing liberty caps. And the New York Sun called Bryan William Jacobin Bryan. In the end, McKinley won handily and the People's Party collapsed. McKinley presided over years of plutocrat-friendly policies at home and warmongering abroad until he was assassinated by an anarchist factory worker in 1901. So Trump is telling us explicitly that William McKinley is the president he identifies with, the guy he sees himself in. And you know what? He's right. He's exactly right. We should take it seriously. And there's just one larger point I want to touch on here before I finish, which is how to think about Trump in terms of historical comparisons in general. I just finished comparing Trump to William McKinley. Elsewhere in an article I wrote after the election for Damage Magazine, I compared him to Woodrow Wilson, who, remember, started the first Red Scare, deported Emma Goldman to Russia, threw Eugene Debs in prison for speaking out against World War I, and, invaded Mexico. Elsewhere in that article, I also compared him to Dwight D. Eisenhower, who we usually don't think of as a supervillain. I mean, as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, Eisenhower helped defeat the greatest villains of the 20th century in World War II. And on his way out of office, he said some nice stuff about the need to limit the military-industrial complex, which he built up for the last several years. But also, Eisenhower presided over the second Red Scare, some really scary repression of the left. And he did what Trump wants to do now, which is to use the U.S. military for mass deportation of migrants. In fact, since this was the 1950s, before shame had been invented, the actual official name of the operation, I swear to God, was Operation Wetback. And one reason for exploring these analogies is that we tend to analogize every awful reactionary figure to Hitler and Mussolini. Those were our go-to villains for obvious and good reasons. So those are the analogies that spring to mind. And then anyone saying, no, guys, this is hyperbole, is seen as like that's interpreted as saying, oh, don't be alarmed by Trump. Trump is fine. Maybe Trump isn't even worse than the Democrats. But I actually think Trump is a lot worse than the Democrats. I think it's a catastrophe that he's back in office. A catastrophe for which, by the way, I blame the Democrats for sucking and, running an awful campaign. And I think understanding all of the terrible and scary stuff that's happened in previous American history, how it was bad, it was awful, but we kept fighting and we got through it, can actually be really helpful in steering the right course between the twin dangers of minimizing the harm and potential dangers of a second Trump term on the one hand, and on the other hand, a really unproductive kind of doomerism. And I want to close this out by quoting one of the smartest commentators in American politics I can think of, Corey Robin, who just said something really smart about this in a social media post, right? So if you don't know Corey, he's a political theorist. He wrote a really good book called The Reactionary Mind. And here's what he said. Chalkbeat, which is one of the very best publications reporting on education, has an excellent piece today on how school leaders are fighting back against Trump. In Chicago, 2 officials from Homeland Security showed up at an elementary school. Thinking they were ICE and trained to refuse entry to any immigration official, the staff at the school refused to let them in. As it turns out, they were from the Secret Service, had nothing to do with immigration. In New York City, the mother of a student in middle school called the principal, saying she was too afraid to send her child to school. The principal told her to send the child to school, adding, ICE is going to have to arrest me before they arrest your daughter. He reassured her that he would lock her daughter in his office if he had to, just to protect her from ICE. The mother ended up sending her child to school. I want to stress these stories, and I encourage others to do the same, because the Republicans and some well-intentioned left critics of Republicans would have you believe that Trump is moving through political space like a knife through butter. I wrote my first book on fear, and one of the issues I focused on there, based in part on my own bitter personal experience, is how often it is that the most well-intentioned and concerned observer or bystander who provides the crucial and unintended aid to repressive power. Sterling Hayden, the actor who played the corrupt cop in The Godfather that Al Pacino kills, wrote an entire memoir about his struggles with McCarthyism in Hollywood. And one of the more unsavory aspects of that memoir involves a sympathetic therapist reinforcing the message of how powerful the Red Hunters were and how horrible it would be if you were blacklisted. Merely bemoaning just how effective the repression is, how reality is so terrible and resistance is so absent or so futile, can become an amplifying instrument to power. Academics, journalists, progressives, and those who care about the unfortunate and the downtrodden are all too prone to supply this unintended service to power. Acting as a relay system for the right-wing bat signal, extending its range far beyond what it's actually capable of. And yeah, I have nothing to add to what Corey is saying there, except for circling and underlining his point, because I think he gets the balance just right. Trump, Elon Musk, Stephen Miller, these fuckers are genuinely and deeply evil. Again, Trump signed an executive order on his first day in office, also, by the way, Martin Luther King Day, to try to strip away American citizenship from millions of members of an ethnic minority group by ending birthright citizenship. That's depraved. But it's also a useful example because he probably won't be able to get it through the courts. And I think portraying it as if, our enemies were so strong that, they're going to be able to just, overturn democratic institutions entirely. We're just going to be living under full-on 1930s fascism. I think it's an unhelpful exaggeration for many reasons, but one of them is what Corey Robin is talking about in that post, that these guys are the scum of the earth, but they're not all powerful. They can absolutely be politically defeated. And exaggerating our enemy's strength just does their work for them. So let's not do that.
This is based on data from a bunch of different countries. We're solid. We're good to go. All right. So, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends. Thank you for the hardy band of people who braved the fire apocalypse to come out and enjoy a little bit of beer and sunshine and socialist theory here at Lawless Brewing Company. It's the second event they've hosted here, so we should give them a little plug at the beginning. So I am here to talk about this book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, written by this man, Matthew McManus, who I have been friends with for several years. I think I met him in 2018.
We met in person in 2019 when you came to Mexico.
Yeah.
And the number one thing that you told me you wanted to do was karaoke. And we went out until 4 o'clock in the morning, and you still wanted to keep going. And I just told you at some point that I couldn't, that I was done. It was 4 o'clock in the morning.
Is an amazing story because I think that, I can collect a dossier of evidence from relevant witnesses to say that Matt McManus is not known for being done at any point over the course of the evening. Last night, when he got in, I, out of deep friendship, I violated one of my most sacred principles, which is that when I buy Irish whiskey, Jameson's fine, but I don't buy Loyalist whiskey, Bushmills.
You got to build bridges where bridges can be built.
This is the Protestant swill that Matt enjoys. So I violated my principles and, picked up a bottle of colonialist whiskey, and he was coming in. I mean, he didn't even get in until 10:30. He's coming from Detroit, so it's 1:30 to him. When he touches down at the airport, it's almost midnight LA time by the time we get back from LAX. I'm thinking, I'll be nice, have the offer. We'll have, a glass of welcome to LA whiskey, and then he'll go to bed. And what's the state of that bottle right now, Matt?
It's intact. It's a little worse for the wear, but we'll be fine.
Okay, yeah. It's
I wanted to welcome myself to the city right now.
Yeah, you're thoroughly welcome to himself anyway. Despite all this, he's a smart guy. And he has interesting things to say. And in those 6-ish years, depending on how you count it, I have probably had Matt on my podcast about, a billion times, give or take. And
I'm still waiting for my royalties check or something like that.
I've read about 1,000 of his articles, which is to say that, I read one out of every 5 or 6 articles that he writes. The man is very prolific. But I think this book is a big deal in the McManus oeuvre, right? Because, what I sort of often associate him with, I think what a lot of people associate him with, is the work that he does on the debunking the right beat, which is just quite a bit, right? That, I mean, the man has written about everybody from Edmund Burke to Curtis Yarvin to Michael Oakeshott to Charlie Kirk, and I don't know, if Marjorie Taylor Greene ever shits out a book, Matt will read it and review it, because that's, he's just that dedicated, to the project. And so he spends a lot of time tangling with reactionaries and reading things the rest of us don't have to. But of course, that's, work of critique. And, what's interesting about this book is that it's a positive project, right? So this is the political theory of liberal socialism. And so Matt is, in this case, writing about people who he likes, who he agrees with. So there are chapters on everybody from, for example, Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine, who would be the other side of the big argument with Edmund Burke about whether the French Revolution was capital G, capital A good, actually, to up through John Stuart Mill, who, of course, is the most important liberal philosopher of the 19th century, who comes to the conclusion by the end of his life that, oh yeah, if I'm serious about these basic premises about human equality and human flourishing, I actually have to embrace some form of socialism. To John Rawls, who's the most important liberal philosopher of the 20th century, who makes the exact same realization, in a famously slow and stumbling way, right? He makes it there by the end of his life. To, of course, Karl Marx, right, who gets a big interesting chapter on here, sort of grappling with Marx's views on liberalism and liberal rights and the relationship between democracy and socialism. So, if you like Matt dunking on reactionaries, I think that there's a lot of value to reading Matt actually talking about the positive project, about human liberation, and the sort of theoretical underpinnings of how he sees that positive project. So I think there are a few different ways we could do this, but one way into this, to thinking about the book, would be, okay, generally speaking, when I or a lot of people in the crowd use the word liberalism, we're not talking about people we like, right? It's not a compliment, generally speaking, right? Refer to somebody as a liberal. So what does liberalism mean in the context of this book, and how does that relate to what liberalism means as like a current in 21st century Western politics?
Sure. Well, first off, I just want to say thanks a lot for having me here. I've shamelessly suggested this because I've always wanted an excuse to come to LA, especially during the wintertime, because winter is pretty shitty in Michigan. And I've not been disappointed so far. Beautiful city, great people, and, some real nice sunshine, which is great since I haven't seen the sun in about a week now. So in terms of what I mean by liberalism, obviously, there's a deep affinity between the kind of liberalism that you'd see somebody like Kamala Harris or Matt Iglesias endorse and certain strains of philosophical liberalism. And I don't want to deny them in the book. Usually I criticize them under the label possessive individualism or possessive individualist strains of liberalism, which is a term C.B. Macpherson, a really interesting Canadian political thinker, coined. But when I'm talking about liberalism, for the most part in the book, we're talking about a broader array of different viewpoints, many of them quite sympathetic to socialism and left projects, and some of them, as you mentioned, actually suggesting that a true commitment to liberalism not only is compatible with socialism, but might actually require a commitment to socialism. And as I point out in the book, this might seem like an idiosyncratic view to a lot of people, like, well, whatever, a couple weirdos said something like that. But actually, these were really serious thinkers, no matter who you happen to be. I really don't think that anyone can sincerely claim that John Stuart Mill or John Rawls, what do you call them, the two Johns, don't represent
two of the three most important Johns of liberalism. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, don't exactly represent the mainstream of liberal thinking, let alone the best in liberal thinking. And both of them thought that their liberal commitments entailed or required a commitment to socialism, certainly by the end of their life. So a big motivation for writing the book was trying to inquire into why that was, right? Why is it that a lot of liberals, very serious liberal thinkers, thought that the only way to actually create a society that's committed to freedom, equality, and solidarity for all means that we have to have a democratic economy? The other big motivation for the book, I can say, just kind of in line with maybe what I'm more used to doing, is that reading a lot of conservative authors and a lot of reactionary thinkers, what you see them constantly doing is saying things like, all these liberal socialist Marxists, postmodern neo-Marxists, like they ought to go. And for the most part, a lot of these kinds of conflations are pretty shitty. It's the average like Jordan Peterson tweet, right? Where anyone to the left of Ronald Reagan is basically like a Marxist in a liberal's clothing. But if you look deeper into some of the more interesting and intelligent conservatives out there, people like Heidegger, Nietzsche, down I'd say to Patrick Deneen today or Roger Scruton, what you see is them also emphasizing that there is this deep elective affinity between the moral core of liberalism and the moral core of socialism, which is why they reject them both, of course. And I think that they were right to see a combined moral core or a joint moral core between these two traditions. The difference, of course, is that I think that they're wrong to dismiss that moral core in favor of reactionary and sometimes even radical right viewpoints.
Yeah, so if you look right now at the New York Times website, you will see from about 12 hours ago, I believe, they posted this. There is a interview with, friend of the pod, Curtis Yarvin, it's the
everyone's favorite corporate bootlick, right?
Yeah. I actually have some personal insight on this, which is that this is not a joke, but this is literally true. I don't know what's up, but anyway, he is in the New York Times today being interviewed about his views, and the headline is something like, Curtis Yarvin says that democracy is dying, right? Mm-hmm. We just have to accept that democracy is a failed project, and I don't know, we need to get like Elon Musk or somebody to be our Augustus and fix everything up, as an imperial CEO of America. And certainly, if you think about somebody like that, like as clownish as that is, it is. I mean, I think maybe this is part of what you're suggesting, right? There is something that's more interesting about this than like just the sort of, oh yeah, they're all postmodern neo-Marxist, blah, 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 right? That like, because, he's not wrong to suggest that the enemy of all the stuff that he stands for is some kind of core, Enlightenment values, about, human equality and rationality and all that stuff. I mean, like, you don't get socialism in the 19th century if you don't have that core.
Absolutely. So I wrote a piece on Curtis Yarvin for Commonweal not too long ago, a couple of years. Everyone's favorite dark elf, right? And one of the points that I made in that article, and a bunch of other things I've written about him and his influences, like Thomas Carlyle, is that I think that actually of all people, Friedrich Hayek is right when he talks about what the right is committed to. So in his essay, Why I'm Not a Conservative, you can maybe push back on that a little bit if you want. Hayek says, at the core of right-wing thinking isn't any of this kind of baloney about being committed to freedom, let alone being committed to the rule of law. It's a commitment to this idea that there are recognizably superior people in society. That's his term. And these recognizably superior people are just entitled to pretty much more of everything, right? More agency, more power, more wealth, more status, more opportunities to cheat on your wife. Like pretty much everything that you can possibly imagine is conducive to the good life. And I want to be really clear, right? There are powerful arguments that some conservative and reactionary thinkers put forward for this position, right? But what distinguishes reactionary thought, therefore, of the sort that Yarvin's putting forward, what when he said things like the masses suck and we shouldn't ever listen to them. From the commitments of liberalism and socialism is that liberals and socialists have always been committed to this idea that, at least from a moral standpoint, people are equals, right?
Yeah.
It's as important that your life goes well as that my life goes well, as that anyone in the audience's life goes well. Maybe not that Yarvin's life goes well, although I'm pretty sure it will as long as he keeps taking those steel bucks, right? But and this central moral core, a commitment to kind of the equal moral worth of each person, has been understood in very, very different ways by every socialist thinker of note and every liberal thinker of note. But it's a kind of shared commitment that I would argue that both traditions have, even if I think that many liberals have misunderstood what's entailed by taking seriously that commitment. And I want to be very clear. I think that for a lot of liberals, or self-proclaimed liberals, people like Ludwig von Mises, for example, what becomes very clear when you read their work is they're not actually committed to the moral core of liberalism. What they're committed to is what they take to be liberal economic theory or support of capitalism. So just to go back to Ludwig von Mises, who's kind of the villain of the book, smart guy, no doubt. What he says is, look, the fundamental commitment that liberals need to make isn't to moral equality or even to freedom. It's to private ownership of the means of production. That's like what's essential to liberalism. And if you, from my perspective, misinterpret the commitments of liberalism that way, it should come as no surprise that, to the point about interviewing Yarvin, when the chips are down and you have a choice between being committed to the liberal moral principle of taking seriously the moral equality of all peoples or defending capitalism, a lot of people who certainly think they're liberals are going to end up defending capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, von Mises in 1927 said that fascism, well, of course, it was very bad, was a necessary evil as a handbrake that had to be pushed to save European civilization from Bolshevism, right? So this would be like a classic example of somebody making that choice. You see people like Milton Friedman and Hayek, both making it in Chile in the 1970s. You know, when democracy, you know, threatened to generate socialism, and they decided that the liberal right that, you know, that they cared about the most, if they had to choose, was the right to private property and the means of production.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes this entailed compromising pretty much every other liberal right that you think was important. So some of you might know the really good historian, cool. Potslavinian wrote a really good book, Globalists, book about the birth of neoliberalism. Well, he points out how von Mises, when there were striking workers in Vienna, basically said, send in the troops, send in the police officers, do anything that you can to crush them. And people at the time pointed out to von Mises, aren't you, you know, this liberal guy who's really committed to things like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly? He's like, yeah, but like property is the most important thing. And these people threaten property, so fuck that, really, right? You know, send in the people and like send in the cops and throw them all in jail if that's what we need to do. And if that's the kind of interpretation of liberalism that you're giving, I think it's a pretty skewed one, and certainly not in keeping with what's best in the tradition.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. So if you go back to the other John of liberalism, right, John Locke, yeah, see, so
everyone's favorite John, right?
Yeah, I was not expecting that kind of enthusiasm for John Locke in this crowd, I have to say, but you know, but if we go back to that guy, right? So there is this recognizable commitment to some kind of universal human equality, graded on a curve for, you know, England in the 1600s. So like, you know, Catholics weren't included, right? You know, but like
or atheists, right?
Yeah, you're Muslims, Jews, yeah. But you know, other than those obvious exceptions, right? You know, there is a kind of commitment to universal equality there. But how that plays out is in terms of universal rights to acquire property and then do what you want, you know, with that property. Native Americans also on the excluded list because they weren't doing the proper procedures for, you know, acquiring property.
Yeah, they're definitely on the bad end of the locking stick, that's for sure.
Yeah. but yeah, so you have so there's this conception that you get in Locke that's like, yeah, look, it's not that there's a natural hierarchy where there are some people who God wants to be nobles and some people who God wants to be peasants and everybody should just accept their lot. No, you do have this certain kind of equality that like everybody sort of has an equal claim to, to mix their labor with the natural world and therefore form property rights and just kind of see how far that can take them. And so I was wondering if one way into the history that you paint in this book is say, okay, well, by the end of the next century, right, you have still within a sort of classic bourgeois revolutionary period, you have Thomas Paine, who is, surely shares a lot of that intellectual DNA, but is starting to have some kind of proto-economically leftist impulses. So how does that trajectory go, right? I mean, how do you get from that sort of lock-in liberalism to the kinds of conclusions that somebody like Paine is tentatively starting to draw at the time of the American and French revolutions?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. So I'm tempted to say shamelessly, like, buy the book. And you can learn about all the details.
Speaking of which, there are leaflets on the table with a discount code if you want to actually do so. But yes.
Yeah, but like the brief story is, I think it's important to appreciate. I'm going to use the term dialectically, the kind of advance that this Lockean view constituted, right? And I think sometimes we can underappreciate it or also overappreciate it, and I'll touch on that before I get to Paine.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I foreground in the book is we often take for granted today this idea that people should be treated as moral equals, right? That, again, it's as important that your life goes well, that my life goes well, that everyone on the room's life goes well. That is certainly not the case if you go back to antiquity and many forms of societies, right? If you were to talk to Aristotle, and the great conservative philosopher Leo Strauss makes this point, Leo Strauss would tell you, Aristotle will tell you, yeah, obviously there are natural slaves in society, right? There are people who have a deliberative capacity to reason, and their job is to be cleaning the toilets and sweeping the streets, and they're good at that job, and that's all they can do. But they're certainly not to be allowed anywhere near political power. And women, women possess a certain degree of deliberative reason, so they can be in charge maybe of a household.
Yeah, who says they're half rational?
Yeah. And economics, because that's a fairly low activity back then, right? But that's all they're good for, right? This idea that you find articulated in Hobbes and Locke, that actually Aristotle and the thinkers of antiquity are wrong. In a state of nature, we're all natural equals, again, with all the qualifications you mentioned, is without a doubt a moral advance in some respects. Now, I think there are really serious costs that come with this moral advance, because one of the things that you see is people saying, look, the kind of artificial aristocracy, to use Adams and Jefferson's terminology, that exists in Europe right now, predicated on this idea that there are natural superiors or recognizable superiors, that's all bad. But actually, if we start out from a position of equality, the way that Locke and Hobbes say, and then we allow people to compete with one another, then what we're going to get is a natural aristocracy as opposed to an artificial aristocracy that's going to emerge in a market society. And this natural aristocracy is one that should actually rule. And in some respects, that's actually where I see a kind of moral regression occurring with certain tenets of classical liberalism. Why? Because at least with the old artificial aristocracy, to use Jefferson and Adams' terms, there was this sense of noblesse obligée towards the people. And there's this idea that, look, it's not really your fault that God decided you were a peasant and that I'm a lord. We can't change that, and definitely we're not going to. But, I still owe you certain kind of duties as a result of that. What I think you see in the United States now, and many other countries for that matter, is this really harsh form of a kind of pseudo-Lockean ethic, where people say, if I made it to the top, I made it through my own efforts. I started in the same position as anyone else. And since I made it to the top through my own efforts, I owe nothing to anyone at the bottom. And that's bad enough, right? But if you think about it from the perspective of a lot of people who can't make ends meet, the implications of this kind of ideology are a lot worse, right? It's a suggestion that if you couldn't make it, that's because you're just, to use the kind of proper Trumpese, a loser, right?
Yeah.
You're a loser. You had a chance to make it to the top. You couldn't because you were lazy or talentless, or life just didn't want to hand you the right pair of cards, and so you deserve to be sweeping the streets and cleaning toilets.
Explicitly, you're not owed anything. So like I always think about Michael Moore's movie Roger and Me, set in my home state, your adopted state of Michigan.
Go Blue, yeah. And go Lions. Hey, big game for that.
Okay, all right. The first part of that was hate speech, but go Green. But I'm with you on the Lions. And so that first movie, Roger and Me, right? It's about General Motors closing its plants in Flint, Michigan, and there are these scenes where there's like General Motors executives are like sort of expressing confusion about what the objection is. They're like, well, this General Motors doesn't exist to provide thousands of people jobs and support this community. General Motors exists to make money. I mean, what are you talking about, right? Like that, which is definitely like under feudalism there is it's all bullshit, but like there's this elaborate pretense that you have this like fatherly relationship between the lord and his serfs, that there are reciprocal obligations, and under capitalism we have arrived at this amazing combination of continuing to have these power relationships of hierarchy and domination, but without even a pretense of reciprocal moral obligation.
Exactly. And this is why I think we need to be dialectical on this point. Like there really is something to this idea of human moral equality that any socialist or good-hearted liberal should embrace, right?
Yeah.
But if you draw out certain kinds of hyper-meritocratic and hyper-elitist implications from that, obviously that's incompatible with the kind of commitments that any good socialist would want to make. And this brings me to the kind of point you were asking about Paine, right?
Yes,
so
please.
One of the things that's really interesting about Paine is some people here might be familiar with Paine's work. He was a huge influence on the American founding fathers, wrote a really interesting and really fun, it's really the only way to describe it, pamphlet called Common Sense, just skewering the European aristocracy and defending the American Revolution. He was so popular, actually, that American generals during the Revolutionary War used to read bits and pieces of his writing to the troops just to fire them up against, they were called the Tories back then, in the United States, which is, I think, it's self-telling. And, for the most part, Paine in his early period was a pretty conventional Lockean liberal with a bit more of a radical egalitarian edge, but nothing that seemed all that special. But by the time of the French Revolution, what's really interesting about his work is he starts to clearly transition to a kind of proto-socialist or proto-social democratic view, depending on what you want to talk about. Because he says, look, the reality is that property is actually not a natural institution. It's clearly a social institution. And when we understand that's a social institution, one of the implications that we need to draw from this is that the rich get a lot more benefit socially and in every other way from possessing property than the poor do. And society, unfortunately, invests a lot of resources and time and energy in making sure that they get to benefit from that property, which is the inverse of the way things should be, according to Paine. And there are a lot of different arguments he gives for this, but at least one of them is he says, look, the rich essentially expropriated a lot of the land and valuable resources that other people could have used for their benefit, and they're not allowing others to use them. And so consequently, they owe an enormous debt that has to be paid to the poor in order to compensate the poor for this initial act of expropriation. So Paine, there's a lot of different things to this, but he says, ultimately, the way to do this is we're going to tax the rich extremely heavily, and we're going to use the wealth that's created from that to create what he thought was going to be the world's kind of first welfare state. And by 18th century standards, Paine was actually pretty generous about this. He said there should be things like a guaranteed job. That shouldn't just be a shitty guaranteed job. He said it has to be a quality job that you can leave whenever you want, well, compensated in every kind of way. Everyone should get a universal inheritance, right? When they hit 20, 21, get a whole bunch of money so you get a good head start on life. Women, he said, when they have children, should immediately receive some money just in order to help themselves and their kid get a head start in life. There should be old age pensions, and there are a whole host of other kind of measures. And he says this is all something that the rich have to provide not as a matter of charity, and that's really important, but a matter of right to compensate for this initial wrong they've committed by expropriating land and property where they weren't necessarily entitled to it, and which society has deigned to grant them for too long a period of time. Now, I don't want to say that like Paine was a socialist in any way, shape, or form. He could have been in the 18th century. That term wasn't even in the lexicon. But what you clearly see articulated in his work for the first time in many ways is this idea that if we really take seriously these French revolutionary principles of liberty and equality and solidarity for all, or for that matter, American principles of all men are created equal, and entails this idea that if all men are created equal, that includes the poor, not just the rich, and the poor need an awful lot as a matter of right in order to bring them up to the level where they can be active citizens in their society as they have a right to be.
Yeah, and that last distinction, right? So the French revolutionaries in certain phases made an explicit distinction and say, okay, so the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, we've committed ourselves to this kind of broad equality, but also let's get serious. Some people get to be active citizens. Like most people are passive citizens, meaning they have like some rights, but we're not really going to let them make any decisions. And the beauty of like the late 18th century is that instead of just being like artfully implied, like it would be now, they would just come out and say this, right? Explicitly. So you get with Paine somebody who is somebody who has this sense that, okay, you need to give people economic material assistance if you're going to have universal active citizenship, right? Mm-hmm. But to, skip ahead, quite a bit, since we're obviously not going to cover everything, read the book. But when you get to our second important John, Stuart Mill, by the time you get there, you have something that goes quite a bit beyond that, right? So Mill, at a certain stage of his career, is writing. He writes a book called Principles of Political Economy, which, at least in the first edition, is very just kind of straightforward 19th century bourgeois economics. Markets are amazing; they'll solve everything. Marx and Capital is just constantly taking pot shots at this book, right?
Yeah. I was reading some of that today, actually.
Yeah. So he's got that, right? But, so to the part you were reading today, right? Matt is guest lecturing in my Capital class. So he read, relevant chapter this morning. In that part, right, there's this footnote where Marx trashes Mill in the way that he's been doing for like the last 20 times he mentioned him in the book. And then in the middle of the footnote, he's like, I don't want to exaggerate. Mill does have some, what does he say, modern tendencies.
Yeah, modern tendencies.
So he shouldn't be lumped entirely in with the vulgar bourgeois apologists. And so I think that's like Marx starting to recognize a little bit that even at that time, when Capital is coming out in 1867, Mill's views have started to evolve. And in fact, in a way that takes him well beyond that sort of Thomas Paine point of, okay, you need to give people some material assistance, to like actually recognize that if you're serious about, equality and, fraternity and all of that, that you need to be concerned about relations of domination within the workplace.
Absolutely. So John Stuart Mill is obviously like a seminal liberal thinker. Michael Friedman, in his little book for Oxford, Liberalism, a very short introduction, said, if John Stuart Mill isn't a liberal, there never has been one, basically, right? He's like the canonical saint of liberalism. And one of the things that I point out in the book is it's really telling that in his autobiography, which is really interesting and very Freudian in a lot of weird ways. He had a fucked up childhood, that's for sure. He says, look, once upon a time, I couldn't see further than the limitations of bourgeois political economy, which makes sense. He grew up in the early 19th century before socialism was even a word in the lexicon. But now I do see further. And his wife probably played a pretty important role in that. It's important to acknowledge her influence there. And he says, now I realize that it is possible to go a lot further than the limitations of bourgeois political economy, which is why he proudly said, I would qualify myself under the general designation of socialist, right, or socialism. So he's not exactly clear which of the different competing factions of socialism he identifies with. But Mills' socialism is really interesting and problematic for reasons I'll give in a few seconds, right? So one of the things that he says in the Principles of Political Economy is, look, by and large, capitalists don't really serve that much of a useful function in society. They're mostly pretty parasitic on what their workers do. They provide a bit of technical know-how that we would need to kind of compensate for if they were gone, but nothing that the workers themselves can bring, for the most part, in any given workplace. And he endorsed pretty much a cooperative vision of socialism, or what we might not call kind of a market socialism, where he says there should be worker-owned firms, workers should directly manage the means of production, and they'll probably do a better job of it than the capitalists ever could, because they know a lot more about what it's actually like to work in a work site, and they have a lot of incentives to actually work pretty hard if they're working not only for other people, but also for, of course, themselves as a cooperative. In addition to this, he offered a lot of moral arguments for a kind of liberal socialism. And one of the most interesting ones is he was extremely critical of what we might now call a kind of meritocratic pseudo-mythology, or meritocratic mythology, if you just prefer, where he says, look, I hear 1,000 times a day about how the underpinning moral basis of capitalism is that people need to work hard in order to be rewarded, you know, that you get what you deserve. And he says, if you actually applied that principle with any consistency, why is it that the coal miners who work 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day from the age of 8, you know, it's Victorian England, end up being poor their entire life? Why is it that housewives, you know, Milk was a prominent feminist, right, who worked many extra hours a week to make sure that children are okay, don't get compensated at all, right? And yet there are a billion aristocrats in our country who inherit their wealth, and nobody seems to have any kind of problem with that. So if we actually applied this principle with any kind of consistency, that those who do not work do not eat, actually the poor in our society would be quite a bit more affluent, and it'd be the rich who would be in an awful lot of trouble. And he says the reason why we don't bother to do anything about this, of course, it's not to the advantage of the rich and powerful to actually do anything about it. Now, I want to be clear. I think there are a lot of good things about Mills' socialism. It's a combination of like a really firm commitment to liberal liberties on things like freedom of expression, freedom of speech, assembly.
Be nice if it extended it to India.
Well, that's it, right? So one of the major problems that I point out in Mills' approach is precisely this really horrible endorsement of British imperialism. I want to make clear, right, for those who read the book, I call it a retrieval, not a defense. I say that, and that's not a kind of cop-out. The reason I say it's a retrieval, not a defense, is there's a lot of problems with what all the authors that I praise in the book happen to say. In Mills' case, this defense of English imperialism in India is a very glaring example, not just of his kind of blind spot about Western chauvinism, but a lot of liberals' blind spot on Western chauvinism more generally. And this is why I take very seriously the insight of a self-declared black radical liberal, Charles Mills, the second Mills, I guess we'll call him, where he says, look, like, there are a lot of good reasons to take seriously a kind of socialist approach to these liberal thinkers. But we have to acknowledge that a lot of them held really fucking racist views about a lot of topics, including imperialism. And obviously all that needs to go. And it can't just go in the sense that we say, well, it was problematic, but now we're done with that. We need to recognize how deeply embedded a lot of these kind of chauvinist views were in their outlook, and work hard to try to extricate that to save what's of value in their writings.
Yeah, so I did have questions about the Charles Mills chapter, and I do want to get to that, but I do want to linger on Mill for a moment, right? So if you think about this, and I guess I'm probably falling into here a sort of like, you know, historical materialist wiggishness about the history of philosophy, that it's like all these guys are inching closer and closer to, you know, the truth, you know, which is just being a Marxist. But like, if you think about John Stuart Mill's combination of views, it seems like the biggest conceptual advance from somebody like Thomas Paine even is this recognition, right? That like, okay, it's not just that income inequality is bad, because that's not unique to any of these people, right? You read David Leigh Williams' book, the greatest,
really good book. Yeah.
Greatest of All Plagues. We both wrote reviews of it. It's The Greatest of All Plagues: How Economic Inequality Shaped Political Thought from Plato to Marx. And it's like, yeah, concern about material inequality is like all over the history of Western philosophy.
I just want to interject and say it's kind of funny when you hear all these people talk about like we need to get back to Western civ and like really return to the values of Western civilization. And reading that book, I was like, okay, well, one of the values that we can return to is Plato's insistence that no person should have more than 5 times the wealth of any other. And if you do that, your society is destined to go right downhill, right?
Yeah. I mean, in the laws, Plato is giving advice, or the Athenian stranger, who's Plato's stand-in in the dialogue, is giving advice for people founding a new city about what the laws of that city should be. And he says, he thinks that like no citizen should be able to accumulate more than 5 times as much wealth as any other citizen. And if anybody's suspected of doing so, you should be able to take them to court and get it confiscated. So yeah, if you want to do the thing that all the people with the statue obvious on Twitter, say, and
it's what Jordan Peterson wants.
Return with the V, right? Go back to the classics of Western civilization, then let's start there, right? So concern with wealth inequality is all over the history of Western philosophy. That's all over the canon. But what seems interesting in a conceptual advance about Mill is like, look, the man, there's no conception there of like class struggle being something that delivers socialism. I think if, we're like calling balls and strikes here, right? Like what he's basically advocates is, we should have like a bigger welfare state, which, I mean, obviously not much of a welfare state in Victorian England, but, we should have a bigger welfare state, and we should like sort of maybe gently nudge it along, but basically hope that the economy evolves towards like worker co-ops being a bigger thing. So it's a very, in some ways it's a very transitional view. But you do get this core insight that, in Mill, that there's something degrading. There's something that's fundamentally at odds with basic liberal ideals about having some people own the means of production and other people have to submit to the domination of the first group all day at work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things that Mill writes about with an awful lot of, I'd say not only insight, but compassion, right? Where he says, and also rage, it's important to note that, where he says, look, liberals talk a huge game about the importance of not being subservient to others, right? That was a foundational principle of every liberal who wanted to inveigh against the aristocracy, the ancien regime, the monarchs, etc., right? There shouldn't be servants and masters in society. And yet, he says, none of them seem to care that the minute somebody goes to work and clocks in, all of those principles about the bad qualities of servitude just fade away, which is also a point that Marx makes in Capital, right? That liberal principles basically cease to exist at the factory door. And in a lot of ways, what Mill is just doing is launching what in academic terms we call it an imminent critique, where he says, if you actually take seriously this idea that there shouldn't be servants and masters in society, and it's actually morally degrading and unvirtuous to be subservient to another, then you should absolutely be extremely critical of the most prominent site of exactly these attitudes in our society, which is the workplace, right? You go to work and your boss tells you what to do, and you're like, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, whatever it happens to be. We shouldn't have that in our society, which is why he thought collective or worker ownership, of the means of production would be a lot more uplifting. And he even thought like a little bit more, what's the way to put it? Kind of strong-willed, right? You wouldn't have masters, you wouldn't have bosses. You would produce for yourself with your comrades and your colleagues, and that would be morally enlightening and maturing for a lot of people. Mill loves this language of maturity because he says as long as you act like a servant or you're compelled to act like a servant to your boss, you're never going to fully develop into the kind of mature adulthood that we think is appropriate in society, because you always have to treat somebody like they're your better, and that's not what an adult should do.
Yeah, so in the course of that, you mentioned Marx, And for my money, the Marx chapter is the most interesting chapter of this book.
I will say, shameless, self-promotion. I did work really hard on that one because boy, oh boy, was it hard. And I was like, I got to get this at least somewhat right.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is probably the chapter that like slides most from the sort of work of recovery that the rest of the book is doing. That's like, okay, we want to sort of, it's not, I mean, it's obviously not like neutral history of ideas. I mean, it's politically engaged. He's recovering this stuff because he thinks these are intellectual resources that are useful to an emancipatory movement. But as you say, it's recovery. It's like, hey, let's go back and look. Here's what these guys thought, right? And I think the Marx chapter is a little bit more like, well, let's like really grapple with like the sort of controversial questions of interpretation. And then once we figured out what Marx thinks, is he right about all this stuff? Is he right about some stuff? Is he wrong about others? What goes in what category? And one way into this is, in Capital, right, in chapter 15 of Machinery, there's this line, I think is the one you're referring to there, where Marx says he's talking about factory codes, right, regulating, what workers do, at the factory. And he says, nowhere in here is the division of powers so beloved, by the bourgeoisie in politics, never mind the still more favored representative system, right? This is just raw personal despotism, right? And you can argue that all Marx is doing there is immanent critique. He's kind of throwing this in the face of bourgeois liberals. It's like, oh, here's all the shit you guys claim to care about, when it's a question of how you want to be governed in the political sphere. But then when it comes to how you govern your own little economic domains, all this stuff is out the window, right? But it does seem like it's not just immanent critique. Like, I don't know. I mean, I've read this a couple times, and it feels to me every time I read it like Marx thinks that what he's describing is bad. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, whenever we talk about this, it reminds me of I worked as a cashier for 7 years. Some of you from Canada might know Loblaws, right? It was an independent version of Loblaws. Anyway, we didn't have a union. Somebody came in suggesting that we create a union. I was only like about 20 at the time, definitely not a socialist at that point. And I could not see the managers throw anyone out faster than they would have than they threw out that person. Then they have a big meeting, and they're like, if you guys unionize, then what's going to happen is your wages are probably going to go down. There's going to be a big fight. We're going to have to fire a whole bunch of people. Just don't do it, right? And a lot of people were like, well, okay, we're probably not going to do that and all this stuff. But it really is a testament, certainly from my experience, to how little things have changed in a lot of respects, right? There was one person just suggesting that we try to democratize the place that we worked at, and the bosses could not have gotten that person out of there faster than if they had a whip in their hand and a gun in the other, right? So in terms of like what this means for the Marx chapter, this was a difficult one, right? I mean, I say in the opening of that I kind of wrestle with whether or not to have it, because on the one hand, there's a certain kind of socialist that's just tired of hearing about Marx, right? It's like, look, like, why do I have to hear about this guy anymore? If you want to talk about liberal socialism, just talk about liberal socialism and don't bring all this crap in there. And then there's another kind of a socialist, and I want to say, I say both of this with love to everyone. That's like, Marxism is socialism. If you don't have a book that's basically about Marx from front to end, you're not really talking about socialist politics. So my very liberal effort to compromise between these two extremes was to have this chapter. And one of the things that I point out is that, to your point, Marx's approach to liberalism is a lot more complicated than simple rejection, right? On the one hand, he is absolutely emphatic about the fact that liberalism, and for that matter, capitalism, is the highest mode of production and the highest form of society that we've seen thus far in the world. You see that in the Communist Manifesto. You see that as late as, Capital, right, where he's very insistent about how the tearing asunder of these old feudal aristocratic relations has really been a boon for human freedom and human equality in many ways. On the other hand, he points out that while there are benefits that we've all gained from this liberal advance, clearly one of the major problems is that liberal freedoms and liberal equality
aren't fully realized under capitalist conditions. And so he spends a lot of time trying to think through what can be preserved in the old mode of production, while also, of course, trying to point out that a lot of stuff will need to be checked. So one of the things that I point out is that his most nuanced take of this appears in the Critique of the Gotha program, where he's very critical of, well, utopian socialists who suggest that we're going to have this millenarian break with bourgeois society, and bourgeois right is the term that's used there, bourgeois right? And socialism is just going to be entirely different from liberalism in every respect. And Marx says, no, right? First off, every new form of society that's going to emerge is going to be fundamentally stamped, that's the terminology he uses, by features of the old society. And failing to recognize that you're going to see continuity there means that you're not being sufficiently historicist or materialist about your thinking through of society. You're giving into this kind of idealist utopian insight to say we can just rebuild society from the ground up as if according to some blueprint, and Marx wants to have none of that. But it's also very clear in the Critique of the Gotha program, like it is in his early writings, that he thinks that there are certain features of bourgeois right that are worth preserving, especially in things, in documents like the Critique of the Gotha program, or for that matter, like the Civil War in France, where he's very supportive of the idea of representative government, but suggests that the problem is that under bourgeois conditions, representative government hasn't achieved its full potential because there are divisions of powers that are intended to favor the wealthy, and there's also a severe lack of democratic accountability on the part of many of our representatives because they're beholden to big money or ideology or whatever it happens to be. And he says in the Civil War in France, the best kind of society is one where representatives are going to be extraordinarily accountable to the people who elected them. And if the people think that there's in any sense in which the people they've elected aren't serving their interests, they should be able to recall them immediately. Now, I think that there are some problems with this kind of hyper-democratic, hyper-representative Marxist vision of the future. But the two things I want to say about it is, first off, it clearly draws a lot from Republican and liberal ideas about political representation. And secondly, it seems pretty clear to me that Marx also thinks that certain kind of fundamental rights that we'd associate with liberalism will be guaranteed in this new kind of society, not least, the right to vote, the right to assemble and agitate politically, the right to a certain level of toleration for discordant views. And I see no reason to assume that Marx thought that in a transition to socialism or communism, all this is going to be discarded rather than improved upon in a way that I think we all think it needs to be improved upon.
Yeah, I mean, even if you go back to the 1840s, right? The unfortunately titled "On the Jewish Question."
Every time I assign that to one of my students, I'm like, okay, listen, it's not on what you think it is. Okay, that's just FYI, right?
Yeah. That title really sounds like it's going to be something else, but
like your particle meter just goes like, whoa, boy, that's up there. Yeah.
Exactly, and whereas by the end of it, right, he has indulged in some jokes and some metaphors that I would perhaps not repeat, at a when I see my family for Hanukkah, it is nonetheless the case that if you read the first part of that pamphlet, that he's responding to Bruno Bauer as this young Hegelian who says that well, in order to have like a revolutionary secular democratic state, everybody needs to give up their cultural peculiarities and and their religious eccentricities so we can all be united. And in the whole first part of the pamphlet, Marx is arguing against that, right? He's saying, "Oh, what are you talking about, right? Read the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Read the Declaration of Independence, right? This religious freedom is like is a core part of like what's won by liberal democratic revolutions." And then in the second part, he's saying, okay, but that doesn't go far enough. And the reason it doesn't go far enough, I mean, I know this is like simplifying and flattening the argument, a little bit, but it's. But basically the reason it doesn't go far enough is because to have a society of meaningful social equality, we need to do something about property, right? That's the sort of core argument of that pamphlet. And, and it seems to me that like, I don't know, I can't think of a case of anything that Marx is writing over the course of his life where he's saying, oh, like liberal rights that have been achieved by bourgeois revolutions go too far, and we actually shouldn't have as many rights as this, right? Like, if anything, it seems like Marx at his most sort of exuberantly utopian is imagining a society where, and this is clearly what he sees as the virtue of it, right? People are much more free to do whatever the hell they want to with their own time, right? That, that you can, spend the morning hunting and the afternoon fishing and the evening being a literary critic or whatever it is that he says,
Yeah.
right? And it's like,
I guess going on like Twitter at this point and like sharing your opinions about, the latest David
it's
Fincher
obviously
film or
the
something.
highest form of human flourishing is spending.
Hey, like chiming in on the latest David Fincher film is a very hot kind of activity, right?
Sure. But it does seem like there is this, there is a core commitment to individual rights in Marx that a lot of people might be interested in denying, either because they're anti-Marxist and they want to say this stuff is all like proto-Stalinism, or because people are like really anti-liberal and they think, oh, this stuff is all soft and flabby, bourgeois liberalism that we're far too edgy and revolutionary to accept, right? And it doesn't really seem like the substance of Marx's views fit into what either of those groups of people want them to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add on what you said, I think there's a deep ethical point that Marx is trying to make here that coincides with what some of the people I talk about in the book are trying to make, right? So Marx is sometimes labeled by Terry Eagleton, I think rightly, as a kind of closet Aristotelian. And Vanessa Wills, who's a great Marx scholar, makes exactly that kind of point in her new book, Marx's Ethical Theory, which everyone should read. Shameless book plug for Vanessa's book. And one of the reasons for this is Marx always stressed that it was extremely important not just to acquire a lot of things in life, but to develop our human capacities, not just as individuals, but in cooperation with one another. And I think this is really beautifully articulated in Capital Volume 3 at the end, where he says, look, one of the major problems with capitalism is that capitalism does develop people's human powers to an unprecedented level. There's just no denying that, right? But it tends to develop a pretty narrow range of them. To go to like Adam Smith's example, if you work in a pin factory, people who run it are going to make sure you're pretty good at making pins, right? At least as part of an assembly line, because they have an economic incentive to do so. They don't really have much of an incentive in helping you learn how to be a good violinist or a great author, a great cook, or even a better father or a husband,
right?
Which is important for a lot of us, certainly. Someone like me who's married and always tries to be a better husband, right? But
so weird. It sounds like you're confessing to something.
Well, my wife's not out here, and I just wanted to acknowledge, her important influence on the book. She wrote the introduction, and I was really grateful for that. But anyway, Marx says that under socialism or communism, one of the great things that is going to occur is that the development of human powers will become an end in itself for the first time, rather than simply a means to valorizing capital or exploiting surplus value. You get the idea, right? And one of the things I point out is I think this is a really attractive ideal. However, it's important to stress that a lot of the liberal thinkers that I talk about in the book who identified with socialism or were very sympathetic to it also embraced this ideal. Now, that is not all liberal thinkers.
Sure.
The strain of possessive individualism that leads into what we now call neoliberalism is really committed to what I call an acquisitive ethic, following the person. This idea that the most important thing in life is just to acquire as much stuff as possible to gratify as many of our desires as possible, and also outcompete everyone so you can feel like you're the hottest shit in town, right? But John Stuart Mill was very much like Marx in saying, no, look, we are like living trees that want to grow and extend ourselves to our natural extent. And one of the reasons Mill thought it was important to embrace a kind of socialism was, he said, it's very hard for the poor to actually develop all of their capacities when they're spending 12, 14 hours a day working in a coal mine, and they're probably going to die at 28 in Manchester. And people like Charles Mills, Chantal Mouffe, all the kind of liberal socialists that I talk about in the book also embrace what I call this developmental ethic. And so in this sense, I think there's a deep affinity between what Marx thought was an important or attractive ethical vision and what a lot of liberal socialists thought was an attractive ethical vision.
Yeah, I mean, look, what I would normally think is distinctive and interesting in Marx is not really normative at all, right? Like, it's not that, it's not that Marx has special and unique insights about what kind of values we should care about, what we would count as a better world. Not to say he doesn't have interesting things to say about these things, he does, right? But it's like that's not really what you go to Marx for, right?
Sure.
Like you go to Marx, I think, for an analysis of how the world that we live in right now works, how we got there, and how it is that we might get from there to a better world, right? To a more democratic and materially equal world. Which does bring us, I think, to the last thinker I wanted you to ask you about. But first, because my phone is not functional. How are we doing on time right now? 30 minutes. Okay. So I think this is the last thing I'm gonna ask Matt, and then if anybody has questions for Matt, we can take some questions for the audience. So I think this.
Also, feel free to email me your angry, responses to this, right? Believe me, no matter how pissed off you are, it can't be nearly as bad as some of the shit that right wingers send me, where they're like, "Go fuck yourself and die."
If you wake up in the middle of the night and realize you're very angry at Matt and his book, I'll give you his email address and or actually his phone number. That's better.
Why not?
And you can let him know. Okay, so I do want to talk about Charles Mills because I think this is maybe the most politically interesting part in a certain sense, right? So all of this discussion has been happening kind of at a level of 10,000 feet, sort of thinking about big questions about what counts as justice and a good society. And in a way, the Mills chapter sort of takes us a little bit into the particularities.
One second. Do you mind if I grab one of those beers also?
Yeah, what do you want?
Okay, one of what they have, thanks.
Do you want anything?
Sure. I'll take the hot beanie summer. Thank you.
I mean, if we're doing the podcast style, then I figure I can do the kind of break.
No, it's encouraged. Yeah, I guess you'll find out what they're drinking.
Look good. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, you don't have to do. Oh, thank you.
There we go.
Solidarity. Yeah, cheers.
Yeah. So in the Mill chapter, right? In the Mills chapter, sorry. You get a certain kind of analysis of race in America and how that relates to some of the big questions that we've been talking about. And it did strike me as I was reading this, right, that, I held back from any angry late night emails to you, because I knew I was going to have this opportunity right now.
Nice.
But
just ambush me,
exactly.
in your hometown where I don't have any defenders.
Exactly. But it does strike me that this gets us into politically interesting territory, right? Because, Mills is often really sure that there is going to be some sort of major revision that's called for in stuff like, for example, John Rawls's theory of justice by taking into account racial issues. But it's often a little bit unclear, at least to me, what that major revision is, right? I mean, there are points where Mills is just doing stuff like counting the number of times that Rawls uses the word race, which I'm really not sure what that's supposed to prove, right, about anything. It's okay, but what's your actual disagreement when he does mention it, right? And it seems to me that there is maybe, I might be reading too much into this, tell me if I am, right? But there is maybe a bigger and more interesting background issue lurking here, right? Which is, how do we think about, race or other demographic or identity markers as they relate to what we would count as achieving justice? Just stay on the normative level. What is it that we want? Thank you. What is it that we want, right? What is it that we would count as winning, right? And achieving the kind of equal society that we want. Because if you have a society actually in the car, we were talking about Adolph Reed's wonderful book, which is also worth plugging, The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, right? So if you think about the kind of society that Adolf is describing in the early parts of that book, right, where you know, Black people in the South are being violently terrorized by these you know, de jure, you know, racial exclusions, then it's sort of very easy to say, okay, given everything we've talked about, right, then, like, you know, there's a certain kind of order of operations here that, like, first you fight to extend sort of bourgeois liberal rights to everybody, and then once that happens, then you enter into the territory of the other kind of issues that we've been talking about this whole time. And it seems to me that a lot of the Mill stuff is sort of existing in this ideological space that doesn't quite see things that way, right? That sort of sees racial disparities as the kind of locus for how we should be thinking about justice. Whereas somebody like, you know, Adolf Reed, who I mentioned, you know, somebody like, I don't know, Cedric Johnson, that's somebody who's written a lot of good stuff about this.
Oh, that's for sure. Yeah.
That they would say, no, look, sure, racial disparities are very real, and they're sort of a very vividly telling sign of, like, the absurdity of meritocratic defenses of the existing distribution of wealth. But look, what do we want? Like, what do we actually want? Like, we don't want, like, it's not like the goal should be a society where you have the demographically correct distributions of wealth and poverty into every group. I mean, once you've achieved sort of basic bourgeois liberal rights for everybody, right, then the remaining task is to deepen that into economic equality, which would, of course, disproportionately benefit, right, the people who are on the raw end of those historical, you know, demographic disparities. But that's a different way of thinking about justice than, oh, the sort of core of the issue is the disparity itself and the relationship between the demographic groups. So, I mean, what's your sense of that, both in terms of how that relates to what Mills is saying and, like, his critique of Rawlsian liberalism, and how that would relate to, you know, McManus thought?
Sure. Well, I'm guessing anybody here know who Charles Mills is? Yeah? All right.
Few people, yeah.
Widely underread thinker. Also a great lecturer. If you watch him on YouTube, he was really funny. He was really jocular. I don't think people really appreciate just what a warm personality he was. Anyway, he described himself as a Black radical liberal. He was initially a Marxist, right? He came from the Caribbean and was deeply learned in kind of Cedric Johnson, Black radical Marxist kind of tradition. After the Cold War, he transitioned to spending a lot of time focusing on liberalism, and he launched some very engaging and also extremely provocative critiques of the history of liberal political thought, including liberal egalitarian thought, and actually that liberal socialist thought, where he said, look, obviously people like Rawls, Mills, Locke constitute an advance, a moral advance over the old kind of ideologies of aristocratic regimes. There's just no denying that. But it's very clear that when they were talking about, certainly in Locke's case, equality and freedom for all, what they meant was freedom and equality for, by and large, propertied white men, or at the very most, just white men. He had a really great phrase in his book where he said, The Racial Contract, where he said, when they're talking about justice in a liberal sense, what they really mean is just us, right? People like us. And to your point about him like reading through Rawls to look at the number of times that he's talking about race, I actually think there is value in that because what he's doing is saying, look, for a long time, liberals either consciously endorsed racist and imperialist and colonialist kind of attitudes, even egalitarian liberals like John Stuart Mills, or they were figures like Rawls who kind of tip their hat towards the need for the civil rights movement, tip their hat towards the need for racial justice, but by and large did not make it central to their theorizing on these issues.
So one way of asking the question is, like, what's the virtue of making it central, right? Like, that's like, how does making it central change the way that we're thinking about what kind of society that we're fighting for, how we fight for it?
Well, this is actually where I think there are some, it's wrong to say problems, but difficulties in Mill's view. And I say difficulties because in his last book, he posited this idea of what he called a Black radical liberalism that was going to be very socialist in orientation, right? called for it endorsing a kind of market socialism, said there was a lot for it to learn from Marxism, and then sadly he died at 70, which is pretty young, unfortunately, for a major thinker. So we never really got the kind of full exposition of this program. There's just a couple of papers here and there on W. Du Bois and also in the book about what this would look like. Now, his suggestion, as he says, and I think you'd actually be very sympathetic to this, look, if you're going to take seriously this desire to rectify racial inequities in the way that far too few liberals have taken seriously, what we need to do is, I'll use the Rawlsian example, be more cognizant of the history of racism and its impact in our society than previous liberal thinkers have been. And in kind of Rawlsian philosophy, he suggests, maybe we could have a slightly thinner veil of ignorance, so people wouldn't necessarily know what racial group they belong to, but they would be aware of the fact that they lived in a society that had been dominated by Jim Crow and racism and slavery for a long time, and were concerned to do something about it, not out of a sense of justice, of course, because it's wrong, right, but because they were concerned that they might be part of a historically deprived group. Now, in terms of the way this is going to pay out in a cash sense, he says this is why any person who is committed to racial justice should embrace a kind of left economics, he said market socialism, and this idea that we need to engage in reparative efforts to try to bring everyone more or less the same starting point by ameliorating the consequences of this long history of racial subordination. Now, I cannot tell you how he meant to pay this out because, again, he died before he spelled out the whole agenda. But I do think it is a serious challenge to many of us who would want to embrace something like liberal socialism, precisely because if you want to redeem this tradition, you need to acknowledge that, John Stuart Mills had some horrible things to say about Indians.
Sure.
And that wasn't just a kind of theoretical issue. He actively worked for the East India Company and propagated various forms of British imperialism. You need to accept the fact that many liberal-leaning socialists in the First World War, or prior to the First World War, were very happy to become ardent nationalists and defend imperialism when the chips were down. So in my sense, what I take from this specifically is that for liberal socialism to be retrieved successfully as a political tradition, it needs to take much more seriously, not just racism, but imperialism as historical factors that have led us to where we are right now, and incorporate them into any kind of theoretical project that it has to try to ameliorate the negative implications in the present day. Although what that's going to entail concretely, I really don't know. I haven't thought through it that much.
Yeah, I mean,
or I haven't thought through it successfully yet.
Sure. Well, that's unfortunate because this is a test. So
That's right.
You're being graded on whether you thought through all these things. No, I think that racism and imperialism are very bad, and that John Stuart Mill, for example, that this is like a huge black mark in his record, right?
Yeah,
There's no doubt whatsoever about it. Marx, by the way, whereas he did talk about the way that British colonialism in India was like laying the economic groundwork for revolution later, did immediately support the first mutiny against British rule in 1857. So, points there. But I think the sort of, I don't know if it's a counter argument exactly, right? But the other perspective on this, right, from the Cedric that I'm thinking of, I think you're thinking of Cedric Robinson, right?
Yeah.
But, the Cedric Johnson or...
Oh, sorry, yeah, Cedric Robinson.
Yeah,
Wow,
different
sorry.
Cedrics. But got to get your Cedric straight. But
Anyway, Cedric Robinson wrote a really good book, Black Marxism, which everyone should read. It's a classic in the field, and I cited it a couple times in the book. Although sadly, nothing to
but like the other perspective on this would just be like, yeah, look, okay, so you've got this reparative work, right? So in other words, that you have these long-term consequences of colonialism and apartheid, right, that you want to reverse. I think the question at this point maybe can't be settled on the level of normative theory because it's a strategic question, right? So the strategic question is what's given what we would count as a good outcome there, right? So that's a normative question. But once we settle that, what's an effective strategy, right,
Sure.
for doing it, right? And the sort of
Well, if I could just interject, I do have a partial answer to this. So I wrote a book last year with Les Jacobs, my former supervisor, against post-liberal courts and justice, which was about reintroducing or reinvigorating Dworkinian constitutional theory. Now, for I'm guessing many of you for whom that's a lot of words, Ronald Dworkin was probably the most important left liberal constitutional theorist in American history, really. And he was a vigorous defender of affirmative action. Now, one of the things that I suggest in that book is that after Students for Fair Accessibility, it seems pretty clear that race-based affirmative action is no longer going to be constitutional, especially with a very conservative Supreme Court, which from a Dworkinian perspective is deeply unfortunate. However, it would be possible to suggest that we should engage in economically oriented forms of affirmative action.
Which actually the Supreme Court decision on this does leave the door open for.
Exactly.
And it's particularly striking. Actually, this is the way I'm making the same point from earlier, right? Like it's particularly striking that like if you look at like Harvard, whose affirmative action policy is where like a lot of what those court cases were about. We were talking about this last night, right? So Bert Cooper wrote a great article about this for the Atlantic. Anybody watches This Is Revolution, you might have seen Bert on there in the past. And Bert says, he grew up in a, poor, low-income black household, right? And he says, look, from the perspective of the black poor, a world without affirmative action is exactly the same as a world with affirmative action, right? Because, Harvard, for example, made a big show of how they had achieved demographic parity. They had the same proportion of black students in their incoming class as there were black people in the U.S. population. Oh, great job, Harvard. Then you look at the details, how they did it.
It's always important, those details, eh?
Basically, they let in the children of like a bunch of Nigerian oil executives. They don't want poor people going to Harvard. I mean, come on, like why would they want that, right? That's they want people whose families they could have long-term financial relationships with, going to Harvard. And so the sort of point that the Cedric I was thinking of, or Adolf Reed, also the best Adolf, that I could think of.
Pretty short list, to be fair.
It's a very short list, and there's a real gap. There's a real drop off of Adolfs, but that they have the sort of point that they would make about this is, look, if we're asking a strategic question, I mean, and I think your intervention in that book, right? I mean, is very much to this point, right? If we're asking the strategic question, okay, how do we achieve this work of reparation, right? Like we agree that the status quo where you have these deep inequalities and these patterns of distribution of these equalities that represent, this history of apartheid and colonialism, et cetera, we agree that that's very bad, right? Well, both, even kind of bracketing the normative issue, right? The sort of argument they would make is, well, strategically, the most effective way to do that work of reparation is through the strategy of universalist appeals to shared material interests, right? The way, to achieve, the way to achieve a better society for everybody, the way that you'd actually concretely help the most people in historically marginalized subsets of the population would be by, in a universalist way, assembling this majority coalition to bring about a more materially equal society. That if you have, it's like, if you have disparate unemployment rates, what the best solution is to that, right? Is go back to Tom Paine, have a public guarantee of jobs for everybody, right? If you have disparities in healthcare, it's like, well, let's do Medicare for all, right? And so I don't know if you want to sound off on that, or you want to see if we can squeeze in a question or two from.
Well, I'll end by just briefly kind of tying off the last point, right? Mills, Charles Mills, talks a lot about the importance of racial reparations, and aligned with the kind of Dworkinian point. There's also a compelling case you can make for race-based affirmative action, but from a strategic standpoint, which is what I think you're getting at. It looks like the Supreme Court, certainly for the foreseeable future, with the great orange guy coming in, is going to be very conservative and is just going to fucking nuke those kind of arguments in the bud. So there is a case to be made for saying, look, programs that are predicated on economic marginalization will almost invariably end up helping out historically racialized communities simply by virtue of the fact that many of them are economically marginalized because of history of racism. but it has this kind of universalistic dimension that Americans, including some American conservatives, not many, tend to be a bit more sympathetic to. Now, I have a lot of problems with this cultural fact, and for that matter, this legal fact. And if I could, I'd want to change it for different reasons we don't have to get into. But if strategically your goal is to get people from cities like Detroit or places like the American South, from racialized communities into good colleges, doing so on the basis of class or economic marginalization might be a way to do so in the future.
And those are the people who are most going to struggle with that. I mean, right? Like, that if you are like the black and brown segments of the professional managerial class are certainly much smaller than the white segment, right? But if you come from that background, you're probably going to college anyway, right? Like that's, realistically, right? It's the great mass of people who don't come from those backgrounds, right, where the issue really arises. But I want to see if we have time to just squeeze in just one or two questions. So does anybody have anything they'd like to ask Matt about his answer?
All right. So I think we do have 15 minutes or something of Q&A at the end of that video. But we are way over time anyway to go to the post game. So we will, I think, as far as clips for this week, we'll probably put out the monologue from earlier on Wednesday, and we'll put out the full video, including the Q&A from the McManus event on Friday. But meanwhile, Jake, what's going on right now?
Usually we go to the post game at this point, so I'd say let's go for it again. And I think Andy has a pretty cool, like some actual rock stars or at least rock musicians to grace the program. So probably some of the cooler guests that we've had in a while, I would guess. Not that Matt McManus isn't a rock star in the
sure in a different sense, yeah. Yeah, no, that's correct. If you're a weird person who, when you think of a rock star, you don't think of very polite Canadian academics, then in this other sense, right? Exactly. We've got the frontman from the post-punk band Team Driver, who is going to chat with us in the post game for patrons. I think we're going to listen to one of their songs, talk about it a little bit. I don't know, talk about some other stuff, I'm sure. But in any case, if you are a patron, I think I posted that link half an hour ago or something. So you should have that already. If you are not a patron, there's really no time like the present to fix that. So that is patreon.com /Ben Burgis, BenBurgis. If you like what we do here and you want to support it, you want to keep it going, please do consider doing that. It gets you those patron exclusive post games after every Monday night show. It gets you it gets you the Discord server. Sometimes we release things early to patrons, etc. But of course, look, as we've always said before, this is not a subscription service. I understand people, it's 2025, people are swimming in a sea of free content. These are all just ways of saying thank you, right? I mean, the core thing is, it's a gesture of solidarity. If you like what we're doing, if you want us to be able to continue doing it, please do consider supporting us in that way. If you are in a position to do so, if you are not, share, rate and review, all that stuff. You people have seen podcasts before. You know how this goes. So do all that stuff. But meanwhile, We are going to be up at the post game in about 2 minutes. So if you are a patron, I will see you there. Left is best.